When CEO Madeline Carrington picked up Gavin Holt's device, she laughed and called it a useless piece of junk built in a garage that can barely pay its own rent. Gavin quietly took back his prototype, walked out of the building carrying nothing but a debt, grease-stained hands, and a promise he made only to himself. 18 months later, a screen behind Madeline displayed 10 million customers who had bought the very invention she dismissed. But before she could say a word, a lawyer stepped through the door and announced that the company she led had been selling an unauthorized copy. Stay until the end to see how one small invention forced the most powerful name in the industry to bow. Holt Motor Works sat on the far end of Ridgeway Avenue, wedged between a tire shop and a laundromat that had been closed for 2 years, occupying a neighborhood where most residents drove older vehicles and rarely trusted anyone who charged more than a fair rate. Gavin Holt had run the garage for 11 years, working 6 days a week and most Saturday afternoons, building a reputation not on flashy signage or discounted oil changes, but on an almost supernatural ability to diagnose mechanical problems before any scanner confirmed them. He could hear a transmission's hesitation in a cold morning idle, feel a brake rotor's warp through the steering column before the customer even finished explaining the shutter, and spot a cracked serpentine belt by the faint change in exhaust note it produced at low RPM. The bank had sent 3 letters in the past 6 months, each one politer than the last in the way that only debt notices could be, and the final notice gave him 90 days to resolve a balance that represented everything he had mortgaged to keep the garage open after his wife died. He had turned down 2 offers to sell the property and 1 offer to merge with a regional chain, not because the money was bad, but because moving the garage would have meant moving across town during Avery's final years of high school, and that was a trade he had never been willing to make. The problem with emergency carjacks had bothered Gavin for years before it became urgent enough to do something about it. His customers came in regularly after roadside incidents. A grandmother who had waited 4 hours on an interstate shoulder because the scissor jack that came with her sedan required more torque than her wrists could generate. A retired postal worker whose vehicle had slipped sideways off the factory jack on a rain-slicked gravel shoulder. A young woman who had driven on a shredded tire for 11 miles rather than attempt the process alone at night. The jack that arrived standard with most passenger vehicles had been designed with the assumption that the driver would be a physically capable adult on level pavement with adequate lighting and time to spare, and Gavin had never once seen those conditions perfectly combined for any customer who actually needed to use one. The device that began taking shape in his mind was not complicated. The genius was in how ordinary it was, pulling from parts already available in his shop rather than demanding expensive materials or specialized manufacturing. He used a worm gear mechanism salvaged from an old transmission housing, a self-leveling base plate from a piece of decommissioned industrial equipment, and a dual-stage locking collar he designed himself and machined on the garage's aging lathe over 3 consecutive evenings. He spent money set aside for Avery's tuition to purchase the steel stock and told himself he would replace it before she noticed, which turned out to be a deadline he nearly missed by only a few days. After 41 failed prototypes numbered on paper bags pinned above his workbench, the version he called Road Lift 1 could lift a full-size pickup truck with one hand on the crank handle, lock itself automatically the instant the operator released pressure, and fit lengthwise under the front seat of almost any passenger vehicle. Miles Danner, who had been dropping by the garage 3 evenings a week to watch the project take shape, saw the 40-second version lift Gavin's own truck and hold it steady for 17 minutes while both men walked around it, waiting for something to slip, and nothing did. Miles had a gift for recognizing the point at which a good idea stopped being theoretical and started being commercial. and he told Gavin that afternoon that the device needed to be in front of a real audience before anyone else figured out the same mechanical logic. Carrington Autolife had announced an open innovation competition 2 weeks earlier, offering a national distribution contract and $1 million to the inventor whose product best addressed an unmet need in the automotive accessories market, and Miles had already downloaded the application before Gavin finished wiping his hands. The prize felt almost too large to be real given where Gavin was standing, but the 30-day bank notice taped to the inside of the office door made the cost of not trying very real indeed. He packed Road Lift 1 into a scratched metal tool case, filed the competition paperwork under Miles's enthusiastic supervision, and told himself that even if the room laughed, he would have walked in with something he had built himself. The Carrington Autolife building occupied an entire city block in the financial district downtown, its lobby floored in polished concrete and decorated with framed photographs of every product line the company had introduced in its 40-year history. Gavin arrived in the only suit he owned, a charcoal wool blend he had last worn to a Chamber of Commerce event 3 years earlier, and carried his tool case through a lobby where 2 other competitors were already setting up tablet displays near the registration desk. The other presentations that morning covered a wireless tire pressure monitoring system that connected to a smartphone application, an AI-assisted parking assistant for compact garages, a heated steering wheel retrofit for vintage vehicles, and a subscription-based roadside emergency kit delivered quarterly to a driver's home address. All of them polished, all of them backed by slide decks with market projections and demographic graphs, all of them built by people who had clearly spent significant time in conference rooms. Road Lift 1, sitting in a scratched case next to a demonstration SUV that the event organizers had wheeled onto the stage floor, looked out of place in a way that Gavin chose not to think too carefully about. He placed the device beneath the front axle of the SUV, explained the dual-lock mechanism in plain language without industry terminology, turned the crank handle with 2 fingers, and lifted the front of the vehicle off the stage floor in under 90 seconds, while Madeleine Carrington and her panel of directors watched from a raised table at the edge of the stage. The room went quiet in a way that told him people were paying attention rather than the polite quiet of people waiting for a presenter to finish. Madeleine acknowledged the mechanism was clever, used the word intuitive, in a tone that carried genuine respect, and then asked the question that Gavin had been preparing an answer to since Miles first filed the paperwork. Why would a consumer purchase a second emergency device when the vehicle already included one? Gavin explained that the factory jack shipped with most vehicles required significant physical strength to operate, did not self-level on uneven surfaces, had no mechanism to prevent sudden descent if the user shifted weight, and was consistently rated among the least used safety items in owner surveys because drivers did not trust themselves to use it correctly under stress. Bennett Vale, seated to Madeleine's left, produced a market analysis concluding that consumer willingness to pay for supplemental emergency equipment was statistically too low to support a standalone product. Madeleine had 12 more presentations to review that afternoon, a board call at 4 o'clock, and a quarterly report that her financial team had flagged as requiring personal attention before the week ended. Under the weight of all of that, and the clean logic of Bennett's numbers, she announced that Road Lift 1 addressed a real inconvenience but not a real market gap, offered Gavin $20,000 to transfer the design to Carrington's research archive, and explained that a product without a proven customer base was ultimately a prototype with a story rather than a commercial asset. Gavin declined the offer without raising his voice, said the figure would not cover what he had already spent, and stated he was not interested in transferring anything to an archive that would never produce the device. Madeline's expression did not change, but three directors near the end of the table exchanged a look that Gavin caught and filed away. He repacked Roadlift 1 in the tool case, thanked the panel for their time with a precision that contained no warmth, and walked out of the building into the afternoon sun. What no one mentioned in the room, and what Gavin had no way of knowing as he pushed through the glass doors, was that Bennett had already instructed his assistant to photograph every page of the technical submission Gavin had provided with his application. The bank notice was taped to the garage door when Gavin pulled into the lot at 5:15, a yellow rectangle of official paper announcing that the foreclosure timeline had been accelerated due to a missed payment and that he had 30 days, not 90, to satisfy the outstanding balance or surrender the property. He sat in his truck for 11 minutes reading the document twice, understanding every word and finding that understanding did not make any of them easier to accept. Avery had called twice during his drive back from downtown, and when he finally returned her call, she already knew about the notice because she had driven by the garage after her afternoon class and seen it herself. She told him she was considering requesting a leave of absence from the community college to work full-time through the end of the year. And the calm practicality in her voice, which she had clearly rehearsed before dialing, was the thing that made him certain he was not going to quit. Miles arrived at the garage the following morning with coffee and a counter-argument. He had spent the previous evening building a spreadsheet that modeled what would happen if they manufactured 100 units of Roadlift 1 and sold them directly rather than through any corporate intermediary, assuming they could find a fabrication shop willing to work on delayed payment terms. The math worked only under optimistic assumptions, but Miles argued that optimistic assumptions were the only kind worth planning around when the pessimistic ones led to the same outcome regardless. Warren Pike owned a small contract manufacturing facility 12 miles east of the city that had been running at 40% capacity for 8 months, was behind on payroll, and had been quietly exploring bankruptcy protection since the previous spring. Warren met Gavin in the parking lot of his facility on a Wednesday afternoon, spent 40 minutes examining the locking collar mechanism on Roadlift 1, and agreed to produce an initial run of 100 units with payment deferred until sale, because, as he put it, he had not seen a mechanical concept that clean come through his doors in 6 years, and he was not willing to let it walk away over a cash flow problem. The three men divided the sales effort across every channel they could access, without a marketing budget, covering a regional automotive trade show where they rented half a table, a parking lot demonstration outside a tools and hardware retailer on 2 consecutive Saturdays, several online communities for independent garage owners and long-distance drivers, and a vintage car club meeting where Miles spent 90 minutes talking to men who already owned more tools than they needed. The response was almost uniformly polite and almost uniformly non-committal, and the question Madeline had asked in her conference room appeared in nearly identical form from nearly every potential buyer. Why spend money on a second jack when the first one was already in the car? At the end of the second Saturday, the only person who had purchased a unit was Doris Lane, a retired emergency room nurse who drove alone on highways regularly, and who told Miles, with the direct authority of someone who had spent decades making quick decisions under pressure, that she had always wanted a jack she could actually use. She paid full price, asked no questions about return policies, and put the device in the back of her SUV without ceremony. 8 days later, Doris encountered a rear blowout on a rural highway at 11:30 at night in light rain, used Roadlift 1 to complete the tire change in just under 4 minutes, and a passing driver recorded the entire process and posted the clip with the caption, "68-year-old woman changes her own SUV tire alone in the rain, watch until the end." The clip accumulated more than 2 million views before Gavin learned it existed, and by the time Miles called him at 6 the following morning, the number was still climbing, and there were 47,000 purchase requests waiting in the inbox attached to the basic website Avery had built for $10 and a free template. The initial excitement lasted approximately 4 minutes before the logistical reality arrived, with the full force of 47,000 orders and no infrastructure to fulfill them. Warren's facility had the mechanical capacity to produce roughly 200 units per week at current staffing, which meant the existing backlog would take approximately 4.5 years to clear at that rate, and new orders were arriving at a pace that made the number worse with every passing hour. Gavin and Miles spent the first 24 hours on the phone with freight companies, insurance brokers, material suppliers, and a packaging vendor Avery had found who could turn around custom boxes in 2 weeks, assembling the skeleton of a fulfillment operation out of goodwill, credit applications, and the kind of creative scheduling that only works when everyone involved decides to trust each other simultaneously. The shortage of working capital was the hardest wall to climb over, because every growth option required money they had not yet collected, and borrowing against future orders required lenders who were not yet persuaded that 47,000 internet requests represented real commercial demand. 3 investment groups made contact within the first week. The largest offered $5 million in exchange for manufacturing exclusivity, full relocation of production to an overseas facility, and a buyout option on the patent portfolio exercisable within 36 months, an arrangement that Gavin recognized would deliver immediate cash and permanent loss of control over everything the device had been built to do. One group offered a smaller amount with fewer conditions but required Gavin to terminate his agreement with Warren Pike as a condition of closing, reasoning that the facility was too small and too financially fragile to be a reliable long-term partner. Gavin rejected both offers in the same week because he had watched Warren walk through his facility on a Monday morning and explain to each employee personally that the RoadLift 1 contract was going to keep payroll funded through the quarter, and he was not going to repay that loyalty by removing the contract. The third offer came from a regional distribution partnership that proposed fronting the cost of 10,000 units in exchange for preferred shelf placement, contingent on RoadLift 1 clearing a full independent safety certification. Madeleine Carrington watched the demonstration clip during her 9 o'clock briefing and said nothing for a full minute after it ended. She did not change her assessment that the viral response was most likely a temporary phenomenon driven by a single emotionally compelling incident rather than sustainable commercial demand, and she instructed her product research team to begin a general market analysis of emergency roadside equipment. Bennett Vale used the opening to suggest that Carrington's own research department had been developing a portable lifting solution for the previous 18 months. A claim technically true in only the narrowest sense, since a single engineer had produced a concept sketch following a brief that Bennett himself had written 2 weeks after reviewing Gavin's submission, and recommended that the company accelerate that internal project to market before the independent inventor could scale. Madeleine approved the research analysis and told Bennett explicitly that all development work should proceed from internal research only, using no materials derived from outside submissions, a directive Bennett acknowledged in writing and then ignored completely. RoadLift 1 cleared every level of the independent safety certification, including a catastrophic load test performed at 140% of the rated maximum that the certifying engineer noted was one of the cleanest passes he had seen from a non-industrial device. The regional distribution deal closed, the first 10,000 units shipped within 6 weeks, and total order volume reached 300,000 before the end of the second month. The following week, Carrington Autolife issued a press release announcing C-Rise. C-Rise arrived in stores at a price 30% below Roadlift 1, backed by a national advertising campaign featuring Madeleine Carrington speaking on camera about the company's commitment to making road safety accessible to every driver, and supported by a retail presence in every major automotive chain and big-box hardware store that Carrington had supply relationships with, which was nearly all of them. The launch was fast, polished, and everywhere at once in the way that only a 40-year-old company with established logistics could manage, and within the first week, C-Rise had appeared on shelves in stores where Roadlift 1 still had waiting lists. Several regional retailers who had signed distribution agreements with Gavin requested meetings to discuss fulfillment timing, and 3 of them quietly shifted their primary orders to C-Rise, while keeping Roadlift 1 in a secondary position, pending what they called market clarity, a phrase that translated in practice to waiting to see which company survived the comparison. Gavin examined a C-Rise unit the day after the announcement, disassembling it on his workbench with the systematic attention he gave to any mechanism he needed to understand, and confirmed within 20 minutes that the worm gear geometry, the base plate leveling system, and the primary locking collar were derived from his design rather than independently arrived at. The detail that made it certain was not any single functional component, but a narrow machining groove on the interior of the main gear housing that served no mechanical purpose and existed only because the cutter Gavin had used during early prototype work had a small nick in one edge, a defect he had documented in his working notes and never corrected because it did not affect performance. The groove was there on C-Rise, in the same location, at the same angle, with the same non-functional depth. What C-Rise did not include was the secondary locking collar, which was the most expensive single part in the assembly, the one Gavin considered most important, and the only component that prevented the device from releasing under lateral load. Renee Caldwell reviewed the patent documentation and explained to Gavin with the directness of someone who had fought this argument before that proving derivation in court was not the same as winning in court, that litigation of this complexity typically ran between 2 and 4 years, and that it would consume resources capable of putting most small inventors out of business long before a judgment was reached. Miles advocated for an immediate public accusation, reasoning that the technical evidence moved faster than any court calendar and that the machining groove alone was sufficient to make the case visible. Gavin refused because visible accusations without legal standing gave Carrington grounds for a defamation claim, and he needed Bennett to believe the response was coming from lawyers rather than from a garage, which meant moving carefully while the documentation was organized. Bennett, meanwhile, used Carrington's existing retail relationships to offer co-op advertising payments tied to exclusive stocking agreements, which several mid-size regional chains accepted, effectively removing Roadlift 1 from their shelves without requiring any legal action at all. Gavin responded by narrowing his distribution to partners who had signed written commitments, published every safety test result on his website in full, and offered a lifetime mechanical warranty on every unit. His message to the market was direct and unadorned. A device intended to hold a vehicle suspended in the air should not be selected based on which components were cheapest to omit. Roadlift 1 crossed 1 million units sold the week. A nationally recognized automotive safety organization published an independent comparison study concluding that C-Rise presented a measurable risk of sudden descent under lateral load conditions that Roadlift 1's secondary locking mechanism was specifically engineered to prevent. The study did not use the word dangerous in its formal summary, but the language it used, insufficient resistance to uncontrolled release under off-axis loading, was precise enough that 3 automotive publications translated it accurately in their coverage. A regional insurance carrier announced that it would reduce emergency roadside assistance premiums for policyholders who documented ownership of RoadLift 1, which generated more national attention in a single news cycle than any advertising Gavin could have purchased. The combination of the insurance decision and the safety study moved RoadLift 1 from a product people were curious about into a product people felt they had a specific reason to own. Madeline began asking questions about C-Rise's performance data after the independent study appeared, because she had not seen the internal testing documents before the product launched, and had assumed, without verifying, that they existed and were adequate. When she requested the original safety certification file from Bennett's team, she received a 4-page summary containing no raw test data, no methodology, and no third-party verification, only a conclusion written in the style of a formal report and signed by an internal engineer whose name she did not recognize. She asked for the underlying documentation twice more over the following 2 weeks and received progressively shorter versions of the same non-answer, which was the point at which she accepted that the documentation she was looking for either did not exist or had been made to disappear. On a Tuesday morning, with no advance notice and no communications team, Madeline drove to Holt Motor Works in her own car, parked in the lot between a pickup with a cracked bumper and a station wagon waiting for brake work, and walked into the garage where Gavin was checking a suspension mount on a minivan. She presented an acquisition proposal that Carrington's lawyers had drafted, 60% of RoadLift 1's parent company, a role for Gavin as Director of Product Development, global distribution through Carrington's full international network within 18 months, and a private resolution of all disputes related to C-Rise that would require Gavin to sign a non-disclosure agreement, preventing him from describing what had happened to anyone. Gavin declined the settlement provision without extended deliberation, not from pride, but because signing it would mean that the same process could be used on the next inventor who walked through Carrington's competition doors. He took Madeline to the back of the garage and showed her the wall where 41 failed prototypes were still hanging, physical evidence of iteration that no spreadsheet model could replicate, and let her read a folder of printed letters from customers, most of them written by hand, describing specific moments when RoadLift 1 had allowed them to complete a tire change they could not otherwise have managed. An 81-year-old man in upstate New York, a pregnant woman in rural Mississippi, a man with limited hand strength due to a workplace injury. Gavin told her he was not building a competing product to C-Rise. He was building a tool for people who needed to be able to take care of themselves on the road, and every component decision had been made with that specific person in mind, rather than a margin target. Madeline had not noticed the machining groove during the acquisition conversation, but she noticed it on her way out, crouching beside the original prototype to examine a detail she had seen on C-Rise that morning and had until that moment attributed to coincidence. Madeline launched an internal audit 2 days after visiting the garage, tasking a compliance officer who reported directly to her, and not through Bennett's operations chain, with examining the origin of C-Rise's design documentation. Bennett discovered the audit through a member of the compliance team who owed him a professional loyalty, and he acted within 48 hours by distributing a document package to 4 business journalists containing a narrative that Gavin Holt had served as a short-term contract technician for a Carrington supplier subsidiary 3 years earlier, had signed a general intellectual property assignment as part of that engagement, and had subsequently developed RoadLift 1 using mechanical concepts derived from Carrington research. The story was false in every material detail, Gavin had done 2 weeks of contract repair work for a supplier that had no connection to any Carrington research activity. But the documents Bennett provided were convincing forgeries, and 2 of the 4 journalists ran the story before verifying the timeline. The effect on Roadlift One's commercial standing was immediate and significant. 3 retail chains suspended their orders pending legal clarity. A national auto parts retailer pulled the product from its website with a statement about its policy of not carrying items under active intellectual property dispute, and the order volume that had been growing week over week flattened and then declined for the first time since the clip of Doris Lane had posted. Bennett also used a network of anonymous accounts to distribute a video claiming that Roadlift One's locking mechanism had been observed failing during a test performed by an independent mechanical engineer. A video that contained no identifying information about the engineer, no verifiable test conditions, and no documentation, but that accumulated substantial viewing before it was flagged as misleading. Avery had been keeping records that she had not told her father about, because she had not wanted him to know she was worried. Since the day he first assembled the working prototype, she had kept a time-stamped archive of photographs documenting every version of the design, saved purchase receipts for every piece of raw material organized by date, downloaded and backed up every email thread between her father and Warren Pike and Miles, preserved the complete submission package sent to Carrington's competition with delivery confirmation, and maintained a running folder of photographs showing the locking collar mechanism at various stages of development, the earliest of which predated Bennett's claimed C-Rise project start date by 14 months. The archive established beyond reasonable dispute that Gavin had developed the complete mechanism independently and prior to any possible contact with Carrington's research teams, but it did not yet identify who had transmitted the files. Renee Caldwell identified the transmission path when she cross-referenced the metadata on the digital files Carrington had used in its C-Rise patent application against the access logs from the competition submission portal. A user account registered to a former junior assistant in Bennett's office had downloaded the full technical package 3 days after Gavin's presentation, and the timestamps matched a window when Bennett had been in the building, and the assistant had logged in from his personal workstation rather than the general office system. The assistant had left Carrington 6 months after the competition and agreed, when contacted by Renee's office, to provide a written statement confirming that Bennett had directed him to copy and forward the files. The statement was obtained, signed, and secured before Bennett's legal team had any reason to believe the transmission path had been traced. The regulatory notice arrived at Carrington Autolife on a Thursday morning from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, citing 3 documented incidents in which C-Rise units had descended unexpectedly during use and requesting a full explanation of the product's certification testing methodology within 14 business days. Bennett brought the notice to Madeline with a proposed response, attributing the incidents to improper user technique, characterizing the locking mechanism as performing within design tolerances, and recommending against a voluntary recall on the grounds that the incidents were too few to establish a systemic defect. Attached to the proposed response was a 1-page certification summary that Bennett described as the original test documentation, which Madeline recognized as a version of the same 4-page summary she had been given twice before, now reformatted to appear more official. She spent 3 hours that afternoon searching the document management system with credentials she had not used in 6 months, working through archive folders that Bennett's team managed and that she had not directly accessed since delegating operational oversight 18 months earlier. In a subfolder labeled with a project code she did not recognize, she found 2 files, The first was a deleted internal test report from before Sea-Rise's launch, which documented a specific failure mode in the locking collar under lateral load and recommended against release without design modification, bearing the electronic signature of an engineer who had left the company 4 months after filing it. The second file was a compressed archive containing a complete copy of Gavin's competition submission. Every drawing, every specification, every photograph of the prototype mechanism, stored in a folder with a creation timestamp placing it 3 days after his presentation. Madeline understood the full shape of what had happened. Bennett had not simply moved quickly on a competitive opportunity. He had knowingly used a stolen design, knowingly removed the safety feature that made it functional, knowingly filed the test report that warned against release, and then built a paper trail designed to redirect responsibility toward her if the situation unraveled. The document she was being asked to sign would have made her the person who certified that Sea-Rise's failures were unrelated to its design, the opposite of what the buried report concluded, and would have made her personally liable for any future injuries after the signing. She printed both files, cleared her personal workstation's cache, forwarded copies to encrypted personal storage using a route that did not pass through Carrington's internal servers, and called Renee Caldwell's office from her personal phone. Madeline attended the full board meeting the following Tuesday, placed both printed documents on the table without preamble, stated that she was declining to sign the regulatory response as drafted, informed the board that Sea-Rise's design had been derived from a stolen submission and that the safety documentation supporting its release had been falsified, and requested that the company initiate a voluntary recall and enter settlement discussions with Gavin Holt. The board voted 6-3 to place her on indefinite administrative leave. She was escorted from the building by security, surrendered her badge and company device, and sat in her car in the parking garage for 22 minutes before driving to Holt Motor Works with a USB drive in her jacket pocket. Gavin did not open the door immediately when Madeline knocked. He had watched the board's announcement on a trade publication website and had spent the previous hour in conversation with Miles and Renee about whether her sudden appearance represented a genuine break from Carrington or a sophisticated maneuver to position herself favorably before litigation began. Miles argued for assuming the worst, which was his consistent position on all Carrington-related developments. Renee pointed out that the documents on the USB drive, if genuine, were more valuable than any financial offer the company had made, because they established not just derivation but deliberate concealment of a known safety risk, which changed the nature of the legal exposure for everyone involved. Gavin listened to both arguments, then opened the door and let Madeline into the garage. She did not apologize for the acquisition offer or for the 6 months of commercial damage that Bennett's campaign had caused, because she understood that apologies without consequences were not the same as accountability, and what she could offer Gavin in that moment was evidence rather than sentiment. She laid the USB drive on the workbench next to a half-assembled Road Lift 1 and told him that she had not acted because her conscience had been operating cleanly throughout the affair. She had acted because the buried test report meant she could not sign her name to a document she knew was false without becoming personally responsible for future incidents, and that was the specific line she was unwilling to cross. Gavin appreciated the honesty of the framing more than he would have appreciated a more generous version of events, because it matched what he had already concluded about how institutional decisions were made. He agreed to work with Renee using the new documentation to accelerate the patent litigation and press the regulatory agency for a formal investigation of the Sea-Rise certification process. Madeline's contribution would be her direct testimony about the board meeting and the document destruction, and she would receive no equity, no compensation, and no title in exchange, an arrangement she proposed herself and which Gavin accepted without modification. The commercial challenge that remained was one that a lawsuit could not solve quickly enough. Bennett, operating as interim chief executive with the board's support, had filed applications for international patent rights on Searise's design in 11 countries, and if those applications were processed before the domestic litigation concluded, he would have legal standing to block Roadlift 1 from entering those markets regardless of what any domestic court eventually decided. Miles, who had been studying international patent procedure with the focused urgency he reserved for problems where urgency actually mattered, proposed a campaign built around doing loudly what they had already been doing quietly, publishing every safety test result and material specification in a format accessible to any engineer or journalist who wanted to examine them, inviting independent mechanics to publicly disassemble both products on camera and explain what they found, and partnering with the regulatory agency's formal review process to place the failure documentation into the official record rather than leave it buried as a discovery exhibit in a private lawsuit. Madeline contributed detailed knowledge of how Carrington's international distribution partners made procurement decisions, allowing Gavin's team to contact buyers directly, with technical documentation before Bennett's applications could be finalized. Roadlift 1 signed agreements with manufacturers in 4 countries to include the device as standard equipment in new vehicles, establishing commercial presence in those markets prior to any patent restriction taking effect. The total unit count had reached 8 million when Bennett filed an emergency injunction request, claiming that Roadlift 1's continued domestic sales constituted ongoing infringement of Carrington's patent portfolio, an application his attorneys filed 3 days before the annual Automotive Industry Exposition, where the 10 millionth unit was projected to be sold. The Automotive Exposition opened on a Thursday morning in a convention center large enough to hold 3 simultaneous vehicle launches and still have room for the secondary vendor floor where smaller companies typically operated without significant foot traffic. Roadlift 1's booth was in the secondary vendor section, which had been adequate for every previous show the team had attended, but by 9 o'clock the morning of the first day, the line of visitors extended past 3 adjacent booths and required a temporary barrier to manage. The injunction application had been filed in federal court the previous Monday and had immediately attracted attention from the automotive press, most of which had been following the Searise situation closely enough to understand the significance of the timing, and a substantial portion of the show attendees had come specifically to see how the matter would resolve. At 11:45, a court officer arrived with a document requiring Roadlift 1 to suspend all sales activity pending a hearing scheduled for the following week. Gavin stepped back from the booth counter, handed the document to Renee, and waited. Across the convention floor, Carrington Autolife's main stage was beginning its keynote session, where Bennett Vale was scheduled to be formally announced as the company's new permanent chief executive. Renee had spent the previous 72 hours compiling the evidentiary package into a single comprehensive submission. The original drawings predated Searise by more than a year. The digital access logs showed Bennett's account downloading the submission files. The machining groove appeared on both products and had been documented in Gavin's working notes before any Carrington project existed. The deleted test report established that Bennett had known about the safety defect and suppressed it. The forged project dates had been identified through metadata inconsistencies. The former assistant's sworn statement described the specific conversation in which Bennett directed the file copy, and the Searise patent application had been filed after the innovation competition closed. The court officer read the submission for 41 minutes, conferred by phone with a federal judge's clerk, and lifted the sales suspension. On the Carrington main stage, Bennett was midway through his prepared remarks when Madeline walked onto the stage from the left entrance, unannounced and without an introduction. The stage crew hesitated for several seconds, during which time Bennett stopped speaking and the room went very quiet. Madeline stood at the secondary microphone and said, without any preceding remarks, that she owed the audience and the industry a direct statement. She had sat in a room with Gavin Holt and told him that his invention had no real market, and she had been wrong in the specific way that someone is wrong when they stop listening because they have already decided what category a person belongs to, and she understood that no version of that mistake could be repaired with a settlement payment or a press release. Bennett stepped toward the microphone, and the stage manager, watching from the back of the room, declined to cut the feed. The board members who had voted to retain Bennett as chief executive had been receiving communications from the company's outside legal counsel since Monday morning and had reached their own assessments of where the liability was concentrated. 3 of them stood in the convention hall audience when Madeline spoke, and none of them moved to interrupt. Across the floor in the secondary vendor section, the digital counter on Roadlift 1's display changed from 9,999,999 to 10 million, confirmed by an order placed at 11:57 from a single mother and long-distance driver in a small city in Oregon who had read about the device in a regional newspaper. The room in the secondary section went loud. Gavin turned to look at Warren, who was standing 3 feet to his right, then at Miles, then at the 4 employees from Warren's facility, who had taken a personal day to be present, and he said nothing for a full minute. The federal investigation into Bennett Vale's conduct at Carrington Autolife took 14 months to produce an indictment charging him with trade secret theft, wire fraud, destruction of evidence, falsification of safety documentation, and conspiracy to commit securities fraud through the misrepresentation of C-Rise's development origin to investors. The criminal case was separate from the civil litigation, which was resolved through a negotiated settlement that took a further 8 months to finalize, and the terms reflected a calculation that both sides made about what extended litigation would cost relative to what a negotiated agreement could accomplish. Carrington Autolife agreed to pay a licensing fee covering the period of unauthorized use, calculated at the rate a court had previously established for comparable intellectual property violations. Roadlift 1 retained all patent rights and all ownership of the design in every jurisdiction, and the distribution arrangement Carrington had originally proposed was restructured so the company could distribute the product only in markets and at quality standards that Gavin's team approved, with no ability to modify the design or substitute components. Every customer who had purchased a C-Rise unit received a notification by mail offering a free exchange for a Roadlift 1, funded entirely by Carrington as part of the settlement obligations. A road safety foundation was established with an initial endowment from the settlement proceeds, focused on providing affordable emergency equipment to elderly drivers and rural households who had no access to the automotive retail chains where Roadlift 1 was primarily sold. An additional provision required that inventors who participated in any future Carrington Innovation Program would have the right to independent legal review of all submissions before the competition closed. A clause Gavin had insisted on, and that Madeline had supported because it was the condition she felt most strongly about including. Madeline was reinstated as Carrington Autolife's chief executive 8 months after the board removed her, following an extraordinary shareholder meeting at which the majority voted to reconstitute the board with 5 new independent members. She accepted the reinstatement with one structural change that she made non-negotiable. Any device addressing a physical safety function would be required to pass review by at least one person with direct field experience in the relevant activity, in addition to the standard financial and market analysis. It was a modest procedural change that would not have made the front page of any business publication, and it was the reform she was most proud of implementing. Gavin paid off the mortgage on Holt Motor Works in the 22nd month after Roadlift. One reached 1 million units, and on the day the bank confirmed the final payment, he called Warren Pike first, then Miles, then Avery. He expanded Warren's facility rather than relocating production, hired 12 additional machinists from the surrounding area, and declined acquisition offers from 7 companies over the following 2 years, on the grounds that he had not built the company in order to transfer its decisions to someone whose priorities were different from his own. Miles kept his original workbench in the garage and used it on the days he needed to remember that the sales count had once been one. Avery presented her senior design project, the second-generation Roadlift mechanism with a refined ergonomic crank handle and a redesigned base plate for cobblestone and gravel surfaces, at a product development conference the following spring, wearing a lanyard that read Holt Engineering. The 10 millionth unit was returned by the Oregon customer after Gavin explained what it represented, and she signed the casing along with thousands of others who sent messages asking to add their names to it. Madeline brought the device to the garage on a Saturday morning and set it on the same workbench where the first prototype had been built. She asked Gavin whether he remembered what he had told her during her first visit, when she had suggested he was letting pride stand in the way of a good deal. He said he remembered it clearly, and that if she had agreed to his terms that afternoon, he would probably have taken the money and never discovered how far the device could actually travel. She asked whether he wanted to discuss a new project over dinner sometime, and he said yes, but only if there were no slide decks, no market projections, and no lawyers at the table. And the expression on his face told her he meant all 3 conditions equally. Madeline had once believed the value of an invention was decided in a conference room by people who understood markets. The 10 million signatures on that device, each one belonging to a person who had been somewhere alone on a road and needed to get themselves home, had settled the argument more completely than any conference room ever could.
Let's go. Let's go. Nice, thank you. Fried vegetables. You crafted new stuff? Oh yeah, I've crafted some new stuff. You don't think I can get through that guy? Really? Huh. Interesting. I think I can.
May appear intricate, but it's not hard to learn.
Good job. Thank you guys. W's in the fucking chat. W's in the fucking chat.
But what he left here could surely help us. Consider today your lucky day.
Damn. Cloud step. That's good, bro. Right? We want cloud step.